So moving on, we've got parts of a team. Now we're going to go on to the next thing, which is the spectrum of leadership cultures. Now we already know what culture is, right? We defined culture before, and all of you, I have no doubt, hold this distinction on the tip of your tongue that culture is represented by groups of observable actions. So how do we apply that distinction to this? When it comes to leadership, a culture of leadership is a group of observable actions related to leadership. And within this, I'm going to talk about two, and these two are on a spectrum from one end to the other. The spectrum is used to assess not only where you are as a leader, where your team is on its functional level. And I'm going to show you at the end how to use this as a tool to diagnose your leadership and line it up to your team. And we're going to use the ability to assess the functional level of your team, which we just learned was done through the parts of a team, with the leadership culture that you should be using to lead that team. And then we'll talk about how to increase it. So when it comes to the spectrum of leadership cultures, there's going to be two ends of the spectrum, two ends. And on the first end of the spectrum, we got these bubbles. Now, what these bubbles represent is power to influence change. So what I mean by that is each bubble, if it's a big bubble, it's got a lot of power to influence change, right? They got a lot of ability to change or influence that organization, that team, that group. If it's a little bubble, they have very little ability to influence change. So think about it this way, right? So if you've got a company, if you've got someone that showed up and today's their first day, they have a very little bubble. And you've got someone that's been there for 20 years and everyone goes to Bob because he's been there for 20 years and Bob knows the answer to all questions, he's going to have a really big bubble. That's what we mean by these bubbles. Now, the placement of these bubbles is important as well, and we'll go into that in a second. The first leadership culture that we're going to talk about, management is in the middle. They're the biggest circle, meaning they have the most ability to influence change. They have the most power. And we're going to call this a control-centric leadership culture. Now, in a control-centric leadership culture, the way that people influence change is through force, right? So they control actions through force. If you don't do this, I'm going to fire you. Now with this, management has the most control because they have the most ability to project force. They have the most power. They're the biggest circle. Now in this type of environment, when you look off to the left and you've got that circle that's pretty big, if that circle gets bigger, meaning that circle, let's say that's Bob, the guy that's been there for 20 years, if he's constantly saying, no, don't listen to management, they don't know what they're talking about, they're new, I've been here for 20 years, this is what you do, his circle gets bigger and management's circle gets smaller. Do you think that poses a risk to management? Do you think they're going to stand for Bob undermining their authority? I doubt it. Right? In a control-centric environment, power is fixed, right? The amount of power there is fixed. If management's got so much and Bob's got so much, if Bob's gets bigger, management's gets smaller. Now with that, management has to be very specific about keeping control, so they got to make sure no bubble gets bigger than theirs. Well, what about the three bubbles above management, those three that are together? Now, independently, neither one's that big, but they're starting to get pretty big. Say Bob starts to move up to those three. Now, all of a sudden, if you look at the overall area of those four bubbles, they have more ability to influence change in management. Now, all of a sudden, management's lost control. If you've ever heard of a union, that's what unions were for, right? The individual workers' bubbles were very little, but when you take hundreds or thousands of those little bubbles and you put them all together, and you get them saying the same thing and driving to the same concerns, all of a sudden, they have a lot more power than management. So this is a very challenging environment to be in. What if a member of management makes a mistake? Do you think they can admit it? Definitely not, right? If they make a mistake, if they have some sort of failure, their bubble gets smaller. right? If their bubble gets smaller, that's a bad thing. So we have to hide failure, right? We got to hide it. We got to make sure no one sees it. Now, if I was a smart manager, what I'd do is blame my failure on Bob, fire him, pop his bubble, and guess what? Mine just got really big, right? I imagine some of you have been in environments like this, and it is not a fun place to be. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the bubbles are lined up completely different. In this, the biggest thing to notice, they're all concentric. The other thing is management's in the middle, and it's the smallest. Now, in this culture of leadership, we refer to it as empowerment centric. Now, in this culture of leadership, management knows they're actually the least powerful. They have the least ability to influence change. Let me give you an example. Imagine if this represented FedEx, right? So management's in the middle, and management says that we care about our clients' packages getting there undamaged. Now, the workers, so the individual truck drivers, their circles are on the outside. So what if every truck driver, whenever they got to where they needed to drop off a package, they decided, you know what, it was too much work to pick up the package and carry it in, and all they did was kick it off the back of the truck in front of whatever building they were at. How good do you think the reputation of FedEx would be if every time that a FedEx truck showed up, a worker kicked a box off of it, regardless of management saying, no, we really care about you. We care about your packages. We want them to get there undamaged. The reality is that the individuals that have the direct contact with clients have a hell of a lot more power to influence control, especially collectively, than management. So my job as management is not to control the actions of the individuals. My job as management is to empower them to make the right choices, empower them to decide that the best thing for them is to pick up and carry their packages and place it there with a nice smile and a nice message of hello to their clients. Now, in this type of environment, instead of using force to control actions as they do in control centric, as management, all I can do is empower you to make the right choices by influencing your actions. So on control centric, you have control through force. On empowerment centric, you have empowerment through influence. Now, the key difference between these is that the circles are concentric. That means that my primary job as a manager is twofold. The first is to make sure that your circle lines up with mine, right? Your concerns and your desired end state is the same as mine or that of the company. And two, to make your circle as big as possible, right? The more power, the more empowerment, the more power I give you, the more ability to influence change that you have, the more that I have, as long as I keep you aligned with the company and the concerns and desired end state of that company. Now, what's cool about this environment is there's some things, right? Power's not fixed. In control centric, if a manager lost power, someone else gained it. If someone gained power, I lost it. In this environment, if I make an outside circle, right, one of the truck driver circles bigger, my influence gets bigger too. So power is not fixed, it's actually multiplicative, meaning as one person's get bigger, everyone's gets bigger. The other thing is failure celebrated, right? If someone makes a mistake, I want to share it with every other circle because my mistake actually makes their circles bigger because they aren't going to make the same mistake. I'm not hiding it. And only in an empowerment-centric culture can innovation thrive because innovation is based on failure, right? Being able to not only think the way that's already working okay is a failure, but then having to go through the iteration after iteration till you finally land on that innovation. A key part to know about this is it's a spectrum, right? So it isn't a light switch that's on or off. It's not like you're either control-centric or empowerment-centric. It falls somewhere on a scale from 0 to 10. Now, what most people think is that, oh, yes, empowerment-centric is the way to go. That's where I want to be. Right? Every organization needs to be as high up on the scale as possible near 10. But the reality is that the teams won't function well. There's some teams that won't function well empowerment-centric. So how do you assess where you need to be in this spectrum? It's all about functional level of the team. High functioning teams need empowerment centric leadership, and low functioning teams need control centric leadership. So here's a simple example to make it all real for you. Think of a prisoner guard and a prisoner, right? So in a prison, you got guards and prisoners. Are they on a team? Now, originally you might say, no, that's definitely not a team. But when you think about it, it is. It's a team by obligation, right? They got a shared background of experience around the prison and the rules. They've got common concerns, right? The prisoners want to live and survive, and the prisoner guards have to keep the prisoners alive. And they have a shared desired end state, right? That in the end of the day, everyone's happy as they can be, and there's the least amount of violence and trouble. So even though we've got all three of those parts of a team, it's really a quite dysfunctional team, right? Imagine if you had an empowerment-centric leadership culture in a prison, maximum security prison. The prisoner guards were just told them, here's the intention. The intention is that you serve out your sentence here in this prison, and with that, we're going to make sure that we keep all the doors open and that you just do the right thing, right? That's not going to work very well. Ultimately, based on the fact that it's a low-functioning team, it's going to require some control based on use of some force, right? Just by the nature of being in a prison, locked doors, locked cells, and fences are all means of control through forcing restricted mobility. And then there's all the rules that go along with it. Now, the best prisoner guards know that if they did just hardcore force and control, they're going to get a lot of resistance. So the best prisoner guards don't work on a control-centric leadership culture right at zero. They try to push it as high as they can to try and empower the prisoners to make the right choices, the most effective choices, to respect them as individuals. And so by doing that, they're even taking what is a very dysfunctional team and elevating it on that spectrum. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have empowerment-centric. Imagine if I, as a brand new officer, right out of the Naval Academy, got into my SEAL team, right? Graduated buds, got into my SEAL team, and I set in there with a full control-centric leadership culture where I went into guys that have been in the teams for 20 years, and I forced them to do exactly what I said. How well would that work? Here's a high-functioning team that I'm treating as a low-functioning team. I could tell you that I would literally last hours before they took me out behind the team shed and beat the living crap out of me. The reason being is that treating a high-functioning team in a control-centric leadership culture is actually putting their lives at risk because they know better than I do what to do and how to do it. And so my job as an officer in the teams was not to force my SEALs to do the right things. It was open up the possibility for them to show me what the right things are. So when it comes to this, your job as a leader is to not only assess where on this spectrum from 0 to 10 your team is functioning, but also to then meet the team at the same place with either control through force or empowerment through influence.